60s, 50s, you know, when we used to do a lot of unique things we don't do anymore? Okay, good. I'm not asking your age, of course. But back in the dark ages of psychology, psychiatry, and some of the people who raised their hands certainly can identify with this, we did things quite differently. We had a lot more money in the facilities so we could provide incredible services to everybody who came in. I started in '63 as a music therapist at Devereux Foundation. I actually had a background as a jazz musician. I was a piano player, and in '63 I quit. I went off the road. Most of the people I was working with were probably sicker than anybody I've ever treated in the entire 34 years I've been in practice. And I mean that truthfully. I didn't know what schizophrenia was, but I saw what it was before I studied it. So I had a great background in mental illness prior to my even going to school. And I very quickly got disillusioned working with, I was at Devereux Foundation working with retarded kids, emotionally disturbed children, autism. If you remember Leo Kanner and Bernard Rimland, who invented the terms of autism, these were kids who were actually being treated by these people who have been treated. And then you get the celebrity people who go to Devereux. Back then, I think it was about $8,000. Now it's about $30,000 in Devon, Pennsylvania, to go for a year. And it was probably, at that time, the greatest treatment facility in the United States, not the world. What I found quite early in working with these kids, do you remember, by the way, when you were being taught your practice, that it was usually, especially if you were a Freudian like I was, psychoanalytic treatment was based on finding fault with the parent. I mean, it was never written that said that, but if you think back, what do you find that occurred in this child's life quite early that demonstrated conflict? How did they get conflict? Well, it was always the mother. Freud never wrote about the father, so mom was always the blame. And that's probably, Scott, why you're being pulled in by mom, because she's the one who feels all the guilt. Women were taught to feel guilty about raising the kid. Dad was working, mom is raising the kid, so it's obviously mom's fault. Dad comes home, he's the disciplinarian. So we would spend months analyzing and evaluating what mom did wrong. Now, Dad was working, so he couldn't do anything wrong. So we'd find out, well, the kid was, didn't suck their thumb, they weren't breastfed properly, they were breastfed too short a time, they were toilet trained too rigidly, or they were in the ordinal position of children. They were the firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn, or fourthborn. It didn't matter what it was, we'd find fault whatever the ordinal position was. I had asked a question in a treatment team review that I had stated, it appears to me that here is a child who's coming out of a sibling group of 3 kids. This kid is the second born. This kid's schizophrenic. Child number 1 and 3 are loving, desirable, easy to raise children. So the psychiatrist would come up and say something, well, you don't understand, Norman, that this is the second born, he was missed in the pocket, they ignored him. And in their ignoring this child, he developed isolation, he developed anaclitic depression, he developed double bind, whatever he developed, he developed. Then we'd see a few weeks later a child who was the firstborn. Well, this is the firstborn. All the responsibility was placed on this firstborn child. So that's the reason he developed phobias or depression or whatever symptoms that were presenting. Back then, if you also recall, in the 60s and 50s and 40s, that schizophrenia was blamed on the mother as well. Remember the double bind theory? Classic double bind theory is during Christmas a child gets two sweaters as gifts from the mother. The kid comes downstairs with one of the sweaters. He says, how do I look, Mom? She says, you don't like the other sweater? So that's supposed to cause schizophrenia, where a child can't make up their mind to please mom. And back then, people were talking about Freud as fact, not theory. If Freud said it, it was a fact. And so bringing up these questions, you became a malcontent in the psychoanalytic parlance of our groups. Even today, when I sent out these brochures, there were letters coming back from, I got one from a clinical social worker. I won't read it because it'll bore, it's sort of boring, but he spent probably a couple days writing this, researching it, telling me that He's offended by my using the word uncaring child. And uncaring to him, I should have said overacted, highly spirited, difficult maybe at the least. But uncaring, he said, no child is uncaring. And he cited 3 or 4 references. So it was a real brilliant critique. But again, this is, I think, how most people are going to, not most, the general population deals with this. And if you look on the talk shows today, a mother or a father gets up and they say they want to divorce their child, everyone boos in the audience. So they're already being thrown darts at. So this is a very unpopular kind of field to even discuss that a child, it may be the child's fault. Going back to the 60s. While at Devereux, we continue to see difficult kids, wild kids, hyperactive kids, autistic kids. Autistic children are also blamed on mom and dad as being cold and ineffectual. So they caused autism. So it took 20 more years to realize that it was chemical imbalances, hereditary kind of factors, and who knows what ADD was called back in the 50s? Remember? What's that?
Hyperactive, organic
brain. There, MBD. MBD, not ADD, MBD, minimal brain dysfunction. And we had thousands of workshops on MBD. The classic thing was we could never find an organic cause of this. And so therefore, we didn't know what it was. So it was a catch-all like bipolar disorder is today. So back in the 60s and the 70s, working our way through this kind of dilemma, we're trying to find some reason for these kids to have these kind of major difficulties. And to even infer that maybe they were born this way was absolutely unheard of. It was always caused by someone. And if it wasn't the mother, it was an uncle who may have abused the child, or the father could have been abusive. So there are bad parents. I mean, we all know that. This is not a seminar in trying to get rid of the idea that bad parents don't raise difficult kids. That we know. We're also talking about a certain segment of children that I believe are wired different right from the beginning. And if you really look at the early infancy and the toddlership, we'll see things that I'm outlining in this course that you'll start to begin to say, hey, these are soft signs. These are kind of behavioral differences that seem to look different than another child or 19 other kids that do different kind of behaviors. I also, in diagnosing these kind of children, I try to look at a behavioral complex versus a symptomatology complex. For instance, in treating uncaring children, I want to know if there is any other symptoms. I differentiate symptoms and behavior. If a child comes in with depression, anxiety, phobias, etc., 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 and they're also having problematic behavior, that to me is not an uncaring child. Okay, this may be uncaring characteristics, but the classical uncaring child is symptom-free. These children, I believe, from my research and studies and looking at the different characteristics of children, appear to be coming 1 out of 20, 5% of the children appear to have this complex. Now, there are varying degrees of the other 19 kids. They may have some of these traits. As you go down the list or the criteria of difficulty, the prognosis is always better. If you have the one child out of 100, out of 20, the 5%, that child will never change. So we always hope that when we see our kid, it's not that kid. That's the kid who goes to jail for 6 months, comes out and steals a car again. Goes back to jail, goes in for a year this time, and goes into a home and never seems to learn from experience. That's the 5% of difficulty that nobody's going to treat or deal with. It's impossible. They're not going to learn from anything they do. We're going to try to deal with the other children that fall within that other group that maybe after a while we can rewire some of the thinking processes so that they can start to learn from their mistakes. If we are consistent enough, effective enough, and persevering enough so that we can work with these kids. I have